Welcome to Midnight Murmur. Here, the night comes alive with chilling tales and spine-tingling stories. If you crave the thrill of the unknown and the eerie whisper of the supernatural, you've found your new haunt. Join us as we dive into the darkest corners of the human mind, unraveling short horror stories that will keep you up at night. Hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and let the murmur begin. The Dawn of Decay. It started with a whisper, a rumor of a strange illness spreading in the city. The news channels reported isolated incidents at first bizarre, violent behavior that escalated into uncontrollable chaos. People were attacking one another with a savagery that defied explanation. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed, and the authorities scrambled to maintain order. Sarah, a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, was on her shift when the first wave of patients arrived. They were covered in blood, their eyes wild with terror. She and her colleagues worked frantically to treat the wounded, but the bites were like nothing they had ever seen. Flesh rotted away rapidly, veins turned black, and within hours, the bitten were dead. But death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The hospital descended into chaos as the dead began to rise. Patients who had been pronounced dead minutes earlier now staggered to their feet, their eyes glassy and vacant. They attacked without warning, their teeth snapping and tearing at flesh. Sarah witnessed Dr. Bennett, a seasoned surgeon, get overpowered by a reanimated patient. The doctor's screams echoed through the corridors as the creature bit into his throat, blood spurting like a crimson fountain. Panic erupted. People ran in all directions, but there was no escape from the madness. Sarah managed to barricade herself in a supply closet with a few others. They listened to the horrifying sounds outside, the moans of the undead, the screams of the living. Through the small window, Sarah saw the city skyline in the distance, fires illuminating the dark sky. The world outside was falling apart. Morning came, and with it, a brief lull in the violence. Sarah and the others decided to make a run for it. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: scalpels, Roman forestands, anything that could be used as a weapon. The hospital was a war zone, bodies littering the hallways, blood smeared on the walls. They moved quickly and quietly, avoiding the undead as best they could. The hospital's main entrance was blocked, so they headed for the underground parking garage. As they descended the stairs, they encountered a group of zombies feasting on a body. The stench of decay was overpowering. One of Sarah's companions, a young intern named Jake, panicked and ran. The noise attracted the zombies, who turned their attention to the fleeing intern. Sarah watched in horror as they swarmed him, ripping him apart. She and the others took the opportunity to slip past, the sounds of Jake's screams echoing in their ears. The city streets were worse than the hospital. Cars were abandoned, some still burning. The undead roamed in packs, attacking anything that moved. Sarah and her group moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. They headed towards the outskirts of the city, hoping to find safety in the suburbs. The group was small now, just Sarah, an EMT named Carlos, and a young woman named Emily, who had been visiting her grandmother in the hospital. They had no plan, just a desperate need to survive. They found a small grocery store that looked relatively untouched. Inside, they gathered supplies: canned food, bottled water, anything that could sustain them. As they prepared to leave, they heard a noise from the back room. Carlos went to investigate and found a man hiding, his face pale with fear. The man introduced himself as David. He had been hiding in the store since the outbreak began, too scared to venture out. He joined their group, grateful for the company and the sense of security it brought. Together, they fortified the store, blocking the entrances and setting up a makeshift camp inside. David told them what he had seen: the chaos, the violence, the hopelessness. He had lost his wife and daughter to the undead and had barely escaped with his life. His story was a grim reminder of the world outside, a world that was rapidly falling to the plague. That night, as they huddled together in the dim light of the store, they heard a noise outside. The moans of the undead grew louder, and they knew their sanctuary had been discovered. They readied their weapons, prepared to defend themselves against the oncoming horde. The undead pounded on the doors, their relentless moans filling the store. Sarah and the others braced themselves for the inevitable breach. They had reinforced the doors as best they could, but it was only a matter of time before the zombies broke through. Carlos stood at the front, wielding a fire axe he had found in the store. Sarah and Emily were armed with kitchen knives, while David held a crowbar. The tension was palpable, each second stretching into an eternity as they listened to the wood creak and splinter under the assault. When the doors finally gave way, the zombies poured in like a flood. Carlos swung the axe with all his might, decapitating the first zombie that lunged at him. Sarah and Emily fought side by side, their knives flashing in the dim light. David used the crowbar to fend off the undead, his fear giving way to a desperate determination to survive. The battle was fierce and bloody. The store became a slaughterhouse, the air thick with the stench of blood and decay. Carlos fought valiantly, but the sheer number of zombies was overwhelming. He was dragged down, his screams echoing in the store as the undead tore into him. Sarah fought with a primal ferocity, her knife plunging into rotting flesh again and again. She could feel the hot spray of blood on her face, hear the sickening crunch of bones breaking. Emily was at her side, her face a mask of determination and fear. David was cornered by a group of zombies. He swung the crowbar wildly, but it was no use. They overpowered him, their teeth sinking into his flesh. His screams joined the chorus of the dying, a haunting reminder of their grim reality. With Carlos and David dead, Sarah and Emily knew they had to escape. They fought their way to the back of the store, their path blocked by the undead. The back door was their only chance. They reached it, their hands slick with blood and sweat, and forced it open. They stumbled into the alley, the cool night air a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the store. The moans of the undead followed them, but they didn't look back. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The city was a nightmare, a hellscape of fire and death. They had no destination, just a desperate need to get as far away as possible. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in a deserted park. The sounds of the undead were distant now, but they knew they couldn't rest for long. As dawn broke, Sarah and Emily made their way through the city. They were exhausted, their bodies bruised and battered. They needed to find shelter, somewhere safe to regroup and plan their next move. They came across a church, its doors barricaded and windows boarded up. It looked like it had been fortified against the undead. They approached cautiously, knocking on the door. After a tense moment, the door creaked open, and a man's face appeared. He introduced himself as Father Michael. He had taken in a group of survivors, offering them sanctuary in the church. He invited Sarah and Emily inside, and they gratefully accepted. Inside, they found a small community of survivors, all clinging to the hope that the church would keep them safe. The church was a refuge from the horrors outside. Father Michael had organized the survivors, creating a semblance of normalcy in the midst of chaos. They had food, water, and security, a fragile peace in a world gone mad. Sarah and Emily integrated into the community, helping with chores and fortifications. They shared their story, the harrowing escape from the hospital and the battle in the grocery store. The other survivors listened with a mix of horror and admiration. For a while, it seemed like they had found a place where they could rebuild their lives. But the threat of the undead was never far away. The moans outside the church walls were a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows. As the days passed, tensions within the community began to rise. Resources were scarce, and fear was a constant companion. Father Michael did his best to keep the peace, but the stress was taking its toll on everyone. Arguments broke out over food and water. Some survivors wanted to leave the city to find a place where the undead hadn't reached. Others believed the church was their best chance of survival. The debate grew heated, and the cracks in their fragile community began to show. Sarah and Emily tried to stay out of the conflict, focusing on their own survival. But they couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The undead were relentless, and they knew it was only a matter of time before the church's defenses were breached. One night, the inevitable happened. The undead broke through the barricades, flooding into the church. The survivors fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. The church became a scene of carnage, blood and bodies littering the floor. Father Michael was among the first to fall, his prayers for salvation cut short by the teeth of the undead. Panic ensued as survivors scrambled to escape. Sarah and Emily fought their way through the chaos, their weapons swinging with desperate ferocity. Sarah grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her towards the back of the church. They stumbled through the darkened hallways, the sounds of slaughter echoing behind them. The undead were relentless, their moans growing louder as they closed in. They found a side door, its hinges rusted but still functional. With a heave, they forced it open and slipped out into the cold night air. They didn't stop running until they reached the relative safety of an abandoned building across the street. Inside, they collapsed against the wall, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The church, their last hope of sanctuary, was gone. They were alone again, surrounded by the relentless undead. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and terror. Sarah and Emily moved from one abandoned building to another, scavenging for food and water. The city was a wasteland, its streets filled with the shambling dead. Every noise sent them into a panic. They barely slept, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of attack. They saw other survivors occasionally, but trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Everyone was out for themselves now. One night, as they huddled in the corner of an abandoned apartment, Emily broke down. She cried for her family, for the life they had lost. Sarah held her, her own tears falling silently. They were tired, scared, and running out of hope. As dawn broke, Sarah knew they couldn't continue like this. They needed a plan, a goal to strive towards. She remembered hearing rumors of a safe zone outside the city, a place where the military had established a quarantine. "We have to find it," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We can't survive here much longer." Emily nodded, wiping her tears away. "But how do we get there? The city is crawling with those things." "We'll find a way," Sarah replied, determination hardening her voice. "We have to." They set out at first light, moving cautiously through the city streets. The undead were everywhere, but they had learned to avoid them. They stuck to the back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where the zombies congregated. Their journey was fraught with danger. They encountered other survivors, some hostile, some desperate for help. They had to fight off looters and fend off the undead, their bodies growing weaker with each passing day. But they pressed on, driven by the hope of finding the safe zone. It was a slim chance, but it was all they had left. Their path led them to a large bridge that spanned a river on the outskirts of the city. The bridge was a gauntlet of abandoned cars and undead, a treacherous obstacle they had to cross. They approached cautiously, their weapons at the ready. Halfway across, they were ambushed by a group of looters. The men were desperate and violent, willing to kill for the supplies Sarah and Emily carried. A brutal fight ensued, the bridge echoing with the sounds of battle. Sarah managed to fend off one of the attackers, her knife plunging into his chest. Emily fought with a ferocity born of desperation, her makeshift club smashing into the head of another. The looters fled, leaving their fallen comrades behind. The fight had drawn the attention of the undead. They began to converge on the bridge, drawn by the noise and the scent of blood. Sarah and Emily had no choice but to run, weaving through the maze of abandoned vehicles. The bridge seemed to stretch on forever, the undead closing in from all sides. Sarah's legs burned with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Emily stumbled, but Sarah pulled her to her feet, urging her on. They reached the end of the bridge, their path blocked by a wall of zombies. With no other option, they fought their way through, their weapons slicing through rotting flesh. By the time they reached the other side, they were covered in blood, their bodies aching from the exertion. On the other side of the bridge, they found a small, fortified compound. The gates were closed, and armed guards stood watch. Sarah and Emily approached cautiously, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. The guards hesitated, but eventually opened the gates, allowing them inside. The compound was a makeshift refuge, filled with survivors who had managed to escape the city. It wasn't the safe zone they had hoped for, but it was a place to rest and regroup. Inside the compound, Sarah and Emily found a semblance of safety. The survivors had created a small community, working together to gather supplies and fortify their defenses. It was a fragile peace, but it was better than the chaos of the city. They were given a place to sleep and food to eat. For the first time in weeks, they felt a glimmer of hope. They shared their story with the others, learning about the horrors and triumphs the community had faced. But even here, the threat of the undead was never far away. The compound was under constant siege, the moans of the undead a constant reminder of the danger outside. Despite the safety of the walls, the constant vigilance took a toll on everyone. Night patrols were established, and Sarah often found herself staring into the darkness, the moans of the undead a haunting lullaby. The memory of the bloodshed and loss lingered, a constant reminder of the fragility of their sanctuary. Emily joined her on the patrols, their bond strengthening as they shared stories and watched for any sign of danger. They knew the undead would never stop trying to breach their defenses, and the threat of other desperate survivors loomed large. One night, as they patrolled the perimeter, they spotted movement in the distance. A group of people, their intentions unclear, approached the safe zone. Sarah and Emily alerted the guards, and they prepared for whatever might come. The newcomers were a mixed group: men, women, and children, their faces gaunt and weary. They carried makeshift weapons and looked desperate, but not hostile. The leader, a man named Greg, stepped forward and pleaded for sanctuary. Sarah and the others listened to their story, how they had survived in the city, constantly on the move, always on the brink of death. They had heard rumors of the safe zone and had risked everything to find it. After a tense discussion, the community leaders decided to let them in. They were subjected to a thorough inspection for bites or signs of infection. Once cleared, they were welcomed into the safe zone, given food, water, and a place to rest. Greg and his group were grateful and eager to contribute. They brought valuable skills: carpentry, medical knowledge, and combat experience. Sarah and Emily took it upon themselves to help integrate the newcomers, showing them the routines and protocols of the safe zone. There were initial tensions, as resources were limited and trust had to be earned. But slowly, the two groups began to merge, united by the common goal of survival. Greg became a respected member of the community, his leadership skills invaluable. Emily struck up a friendship with a young woman named Lisa, who had lost her family in the chaos. They bonded over shared experiences and became inseparable, finding solace in each other's company. The peace was shattered one night when a group of armed raiders attacked the safe zone. They came under the cover of darkness, their intentions clear to take what they wanted by force. The guards were overwhelmed, and the walls were breached. Sarah and Emily fought side by side, their weapons flashing in the dim light. The battle was brutal, blood and screams filling the night air. The raiders showed no mercy, killing anyone who stood in their way. Greg led a counterattack, rallying the survivors to defend their home. The fight was desperate, each side suffering heavy losses. Sarah felt a sharp pain as a bullet grazed her arm, but she continued to fight, driven by the need to protect those she loved. The raiders were eventually repelled, but the cost was high. The safe zone lay in ruins, bodies of friends and foes alike littering the ground. The survivors gathered the dead, their hearts heavy with grief. The walls, once a symbol of safety, were now breached and broken. Sarah and Emily tended to the wounded, their hands steady despite the exhaustion. They worked through the night, doing everything they could to save lives. The community mourned their losses, but they also knew they had to rebuild. Greg's group proved invaluable in the aftermath, using their skills to repair the damage. The survivors worked together, their resolve hardened by the attack. They knew they had to fortify their defenses to prepare for the inevitable next assault. In the weeks that followed, the community focused on rebuilding and fortifying the safe zone. They constructed stronger walls, reinforced the gates, and established watchtowers. The lessons learned from the raid were applied, making their defenses more robust. Sarah and Emily took on leadership roles, guiding the community through the difficult process. They organized patrols, trained new guards, and ensured that everyone contributed to the rebuilding effort. The sense of unity was stronger than ever, despite the lingering fear. Lisa became an integral part of their plans, using her engineering skills to design innovative defenses. Her bond with Emily grew, and they became known as a formidable duo, their determination inspiring those around them. Resources were running low, and a supply run was necessary. Sarah, Emily, Greg, and a few others volunteered to venture back into the city. It was a dangerous mission, but they needed food, medical supplies, and ammunition to sustain the community. They set out at dawn, moving cautiously through the deserted streets. The city was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the distant moans of the undead. They scavenged what they could, filling their backpacks with essential supplies. The trip was fraught with danger. They encountered pockets of zombies, fought off scavengers, and narrowly avoided traps left by other survivors. Each encounter tested their resolve, but they pressed on, driven by the need to keep their community alive. On their way back to the safe zone, they were ambushed by a group of survivors they had helped in the past. The group, desperate and starving, saw the supplies as their only chance of survival. They turned on Sarah and her team, demanding the supplies at gunpoint. Greg tried to reason with them, but the situation escalated. A shot was fired, and chaos erupted. Sarah and Emily fought back, their trust shattered by the betrayal. The fight was brutal, and they were forced to kill people they had once considered friends. They managed to escape with the supplies, but the encounter left them shaken. Trust was a rare commodity in this world, and the betrayal cut deep. They returned to the safe zone, their hearts heavy with the realization that even allies could turn against them. Back at the safe zone, they distributed the supplies and shared the story of their ordeal. The betrayal served as a harsh reminder of the world they lived in, where desperation could drive people to unimaginable acts. Sarah and Emily took some time to reflect, finding solace in each other's company. They discussed their past, their hopes for the future, and the bond that had grown between them. Their friendship had become a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the darkness. One night, as they sat on the wall overlooking the city, they saw something strange lights in the distance, signaling in a pattern. It was a message, a sign of other survivors trying to communicate. The sight filled them with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The lights in the distance continued their pattern, a series of flashes that clearly indicated an attempt at communication. Sarah and Emily, along with Greg, devised a plan to respond. They used a flashlight to signal back, hoping to establish contact. After several tense moments, they received a reply. The message was simple, a request to meet at a neutral location to discuss an alliance. The community was divided on whether to trust the newcomers, but the potential for trade and support was too valuable to ignore. They decided to send a small delegation to the meeting, including Sarah, Emily, and Greg. They prepared for the worst, arming themselves and planning an escape route in case things went wrong. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The tension was palpable as Sarah, Emily, and Greg approached, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The other group, led by a woman named Rebecca, arrived shortly after. Rebecca's group was larger and better equipped. They had managed to secure a military bunker and were looking for allies to strengthen their position. The meeting was tense but cordial, both sides wary but willing to negotiate. They discussed terms of trade, mutual defense, and the possibility of joining forces. The potential benefits were immense, but so were the risks. After hours of negotiation, they agreed to a tentative alliance, promising to meet again to finalize the details. The new alliance brought a sense of cautious optimism to the safe zone. Rebecca's group sent supplies and reinforcements, bolstering their defenses and providing much-needed resources. In return, Sarah's community shared their knowledge and manpower. The two groups began to coordinate their efforts, planning joint missions and sharing information about threats and opportunities. The collaboration brought new challenges, but it also strengthened their chances of survival. Sarah and Emily took on leadership roles in the alliance, working closely with Rebecca and her team. They faced new dangers together, but the combined strength of their groups gave them a fighting chance. One of the first joint missions was a reconnaissance of a nearby military base rumored to have untouched supplies. Sarah, Emily, and a team from both groups set out, their goal to assess the situation and, if possible, secure the resources. The base was heavily fortified and crawling with undead. They had to navigate through a maze of traps and obstacles, their every step fraught with danger. The tension was high, each moment a potential fight for their lives. Inside, they found a treasure trove of supplies, weapons, medical equipment, and food. But the base was also home to a large horde of zombies. They had to move quickly and carefully, avoiding detection while gathering as much as they could carry. The mission turned chaotic when a trap was triggered, alerting the horde to their presence. The team fought their way out, the sounds of gunfire and screams echoing through the base. Sarah and Emily led the charge, their determination unwavering. They managed to escape with the supplies, but not without casualties. The loss of team members weighed heavily on them, a stark reminder of the cost of their struggle. They returned to the safe zone, their hearts heavy, but their resolve strengthened. The supplies they brought back were a boon, reinforcing their defenses and providing much-needed resources. The alliance proved its worth, but the mission also highlighted the constant dangers they faced. Just when they thought they had a moment of respite, disaster struck. A massive horde of zombies, larger than anything they had seen before, approached the safe zone. The walls, though fortified, were no match for the sheer number of undead. The community sprang into action, their preparations put to the ultimate test. Sarah and Emily led the defense, coordinating the efforts of both groups. The battle was fierce, the undead relentless in their assault. Despite their best efforts, the walls were breached. The safe zone descended into chaos as the undead poured in. The survivors fought with everything they had, their screams and the sounds of battle filling the air. The breach forced the survivors to retreat, abandoning their hard-won home. Sarah, Emily, and Greg led the evacuation, guiding the terrified community members through the chaos. They fought off the undead, their weapons slick with blood. The loss of their sanctuary was devastating. They had to move quickly, finding temporary shelter in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The group was exhausted, their spirits crushed by the relentless assault. But they couldn't afford to stop. They had to regroup, to find a new place to call home. The alliance with Rebecca's group provided a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild and recover. Rebecca's group had managed to hold their ground, their military bunker proving more resilient. They welcomed the survivors from the safe zone, offering them shelter and support. The combined forces began to fortify the bunker, transforming it into a new sanctuary. The process was slow and arduous, each day a struggle to rebuild. The community members worked tirelessly, their determination unwavering despite the losses they had suffered. They knew they had to create a place where they could thrive, not just survive. Sarah and Emily continued to lead, their bond stronger than ever. They had become symbols of hope and resilience, their courage inspiring those around them. Together, they faced the future, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. The new sanctuary began to take shape, its walls strong and its defenses secure. The community found a rhythm, a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. They established farms, schools, and medical facilities, creating a self-sustaining haven. Sarah and Emily looked towards the future with cautious optimism. They had faced unimaginable horrors, but they had survived. The alliance with Rebecca's group had proven to be a turning point, their combined strength giving them a fighting chance. The threat of the undead was ever present, but they were prepared. They had learned to live with the constant danger, to find moments of peace and joy amidst the struggle. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they faced it together, their spirits unbroken.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling content.